On the morning of October 23, 1942, a Beaufort torpedo bomber from 42 Squadron ditched into the North Atlantic roughly 100 miles west of the Hebrides. The crew of 7 survived the crash landing, but found themselves in a single inflatable dinghy, adrift in 52-degree water, with a radio set that had been destroyed on impact. What they carried instead, stuffed into a small aluminium canister bolted near the navigator's station, was a blue checker hen named Nehu. Fortas, INS-1, known to her handlers at RAF Wick simply as Winkie. The conventional view of 1942 held that radio was king, that voice communication had rendered every earlier system redundant. Yet within 19 hours, Winkie would fly 120 miles through a North Sea gale, arrive at her home loft with engine oil matting her feathers, and trigger the most precisely calculated open water rescue the Air Sea Rescue Service had yet attempted. The apparent anachronism of a bird in a modern warplane was not the RAF being sentimental. It was the RAF understanding something about radio that the theorists hadn't fully absorbed. The standard argument against carrying pigeons and aircraft was entirely logical on its face. RAF Coastal Command had been equipping its aircraft with Type TO-154 transmitters and RO-155 receivers since 1940, sets capable of transmitting on frequencies between 75 kHz and 18 mmHz with a range, under good conditions, of several hundred miles. Air Sea rescue launches were being fitted with direction-finding equipment that could home on a distress transmission within approximately 4 nautical miles. On paper, a Pigeon offered a one-way, non-conformable, weather-degraded message system, whose effective range depended entirely on the bird's navigational instincts and physical endurance. Critics within the Air Ministry argued as late as 1941 that the added weight, a standard racing Pigeon in its canister weighed approximately 2.3 pounds, was better spent on survival rations or emergency flares. They were right that radio was faster. They were catastrophically wrong about radio being reliable. The reality of ditching a multi-engine aircraft into the North Atlantic destroyed radios with a consistency that no amount of waterproofing had yet solved. Water entry at speed subjected the airframe to deceleration forces of between 8 and 14 G, shattering vacuum tubes, snapping antenna connections, and flooding the sealed compartments where transmitters were mounted before any crew member could send a distress signal. A 1941 survey of 340 ditching incidents conducted by the Air Sea Rescue Directorate found that functioning radio contact was maintained in only 31% of cases. In the remaining 69%, the aircraft had either gone down too fast, the radio had been physically destroyed, or the crew had been incapacitated. What survived those impacts with extraordinary regularity was a padded aluminium canister containing a bird that needed only to be released into the wind. A Pigeon's navigational system, dependent on magnetic field sensitivity, olfactory mapping, and solar positioning, required no power source, no antenna, and no operator. The secret was in its complete independence from every system that the crash was simultaneously destroying. The National Pigeon Service, formally established under Air Ministry authority in January 1940, drew on Britain's existing racing pigeon infrastructure with a specificity that surprised even its administrators. By 1942, approximately 250,000 birds had been registered, with selected strains from established lofts in coastal counties, particularly Northumberland, Caithness, and the Western Isles, trained specifically for maritime distances. The birds assigned to Coastal Command aircraft were not general-issue birds. They were chosen for performance on overwater routes of 80 to 150 miles, tested for homing reliability in conditions that included wind speeds above 25 knots and visibility below 800 yards. The training regime, overseen by the Royal Corps of Signals Pigeon Section, required each operational bird to demonstrate a 90% completion rate over its assigned route length before being certified for aircraft carriage. Standard military thinking might have called this excessive investment in an obsolete system. What it actually represented was understanding that the bird was a backup to the backup, and that backup systems earn their classification through reliability, not speed. Winkie's flight on October 23, 1942, provides the clearest possible proof of what this investment meant in practice. When the Beaufort ditched, the impact damaged the Pigeon canister's release mechanism, and the bird was not deliberately freed. She escaped through a partially sprung latch as the aircraft settled. She was thus carrying no message cylinder. She arrived at her home loft at RAF Wick, 120 miles to the northeast, at 08:20 in the morning. Her handler, Sergeant Davidson, noted her condition, feathers matted with what he identified as the specific gray-green oil used in Beaufort engine cowlings, body temperature depressed, weight down approximately 12% from her pre-mission weight. From these observations, and from the time of her arrival, Squadron Leader Wynne Powell of 281 Squadron's Rescue Coordination Section, was able to calculate the probable ditch point using known Beaufort cruise speeds, the bird's average flight velocity degraded for weather, and the oil pattern as confirmation of proximity to the crash site. The calculation placed the dinghy within a 7-mile radius. 2 Lockheed Hudsons from 281 Squadron located the dinghy 49 minutes after the search began. All 7 crew members were recovered alive, suffering from hypothermia, but otherwise uninjured. Winkie was subsequently awarded the Dickin Medal, the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross, in a ceremony at RAF Wick in February 1943, the first bird to receive the decoration. The citation read, without irony, that she had performed her duty under exceptionally difficult conditions. Winkie was not an isolated case, and that matters enormously to understanding why the program persisted through the end of the war. Between 1940 and 1945, the National Pigeon Service recorded 1,842 operational bird releases from downed or distressed aircraft. Of these, 1,167, approximately 63%, resulted in the bird reaching its home loft with a recoverable message or with sufficient physical evidence to permit a search. In 16 confirmed cases, pigeon communication was directly responsible for rescue operations being initiated when no other contact had been established. By contrast, in the same period, air-sea rescue coordination records show that emergency radio transmissions from downed aircraft resulted in searches being mounted in only 28% of cases, with the majority of failures attributed to radio destruction on impact. This wasn't a close comparison. It was a systematic advantage in the specific scenario, sudden catastrophic ditching, for which the birds had been selected. German Luftwaffe pilots, who encountered the Pigeon program through interrogation of captured RAF aircrew, initially treated it as evidence of British conservatism. A 1943 Luftwaffe intelligence summary, recovered after the war from Luftflotte, Prussian headquarters in Norway, described the practice as a curious retention of Great War methods, suggesting equipment shortfalls in the maritime patrol arm. They were right that it looked archaic. They were wrong about what it meant. Commanders at Coastal Command weren't clinging to tradition. They had the after-action data showing that radio failed in the exact scenario, violent, uncontrolled ditching, where alternative communication was most desperately needed. The Pigeon program was funded precisely because it succeeded where radios failed, not because anyone believed birds were superior to radio in general conditions. There is also a human dimension to this that the equipment statistics alone cannot capture. Crews, flying 12-hour anti-submarine patrols over the North Atlantic in 1942, knew the statistical reality of their situation with brutal clarity. Coastal Command's loss rate over open water in that year was approximately 1 aircraft per 800 patrol hours. They knew that if they went down, the window for survival in North Atlantic water temperatures was between 1 and 4 hours, depending on immersion. The presence of a pigeon canister, latched above the navigator's table in a Sunderland, mounted near the wireless operator's position in a Liberator, represented something specific and credible. It was not a comfort blanket. It was a genuinely independent communication system that did not share any failure mode with the aircraft's primary electronics. After Winkie's story circulated through Coastal Command stations in late 1942 and early 1943, requests for pigeon allocation actually increased from squadron commanders who had previously declined them. This wasn't sentimentality. It was crews having examined the evidence and made a rational decision. What made the Pigeon program work wasn't any single feature of the bird itself, but rather the intersection of 3 independent advantages. First, a biological navigation system entirely disconnected from electrical power or atmospheric propagation conditions. Second, a physical signature, the oil, the heading, the arrival time, that carried locational information even without an attached message. Third, an infrastructure of trained handlers and coordination staff who understood how to extract quantitative search parameters from qualitative bird condition data. The program succeeded because the Air Ministry understood that reliability in extremis is a design specification, not an accident, and that meeting it sometimes requires accepting a system that looks primitive next to its alternatives. The North Atlantic did not care whether a communication system was modern. It cared whether it worked when the aircraft hit the water at 130 knots and everything electrical died in the first 3 seconds. Winkie cared about neither of those things. She simply flew home,